In the quiet rural town of Maplebrook, 10-year-old Tommy Williams stood in front of his classmates, his cheeks flushed with excitement. It was Heroes Day, and each student was sharing stories of people or animals they admired. Tommy had a story to tell that had been passed down from his grandfather, a story he'd heard countless times but never grew tired of. With a deep breath, he began, "My hero's name was Chief, and he was my grandpa's dog." Tommy's story took his classmates back decades to the day his grandfather, Henry Williams, first met Chief. It was the early 1960s, and Henry was a young farmer who lived just on the outskirts of Maplebrook, a place where the hills stretched as far as the eye could see, and neighbors knew each other like family. Henry's life was quiet and orderly, with his days beginning before dawn and ending only after the stars were high in the sky. But, unknown to Henry, fate was about to surprise him in the form of a lost dog. One brisk autumn morning, Henry was on his way back from the local market. As he pulled into the train station to pick up a few supplies, he spotted a crowd gathered around the train platform. Curiosity got the better of him, and he walked over, surprised to see a small, scruffy dog shivering on the platform, alone and trembling from the cold. The dog had thick, dark brown fur, and though its coat was muddy, its eyes sparkled with intelligence and hope. A quick glance showed that the dog wore an old frayed collar with no identification. As Henry knelt down and reached out a hand, the dog tilted its head, studying him carefully. Gently, he patted the dog, feeling the cold stiffness in its fur. It didn't resist his touch, and Henry felt a pang of pity. No one seemed to know where the dog had come from or who it belonged to, and it was clear that the animal had been on its own for some time. Henry approached the station manager, Mr. Cullen, who was standing nearby, frowning at the little creature. "Can't have a stray dog hanging around here. It'll get in the way," Mr. Cullen grumbled. Henry looked at the dog and then back at Mr. Cullen. "Well, I don't think he'll be any trouble, Mr. Cullen. Maybe he's just waiting for someone, or I could take him with me, at least until we find his owner." Mr. Cullen shrugged. "It's your call, Henry. Just keep him off the platform." Henry gave a nod, and without much more thought, he bent down, scooping the little dog into his arms. The dog didn't resist, and Henry could feel its heartbeat thudding fast against his chest, as if grateful to be held. He placed the dog on the passenger seat of his old truck, giving it a quick scratch behind the ears. "All right, buddy," he murmured. "Let's get you somewhere warm." When Henry arrived home, he took the dog into the house, hoping his wife, Anne, wouldn't be too upset. Anne was practical, and while she loved animals, she didn't necessarily want a stray dog disrupting their carefully kept home. But the dog, whom Henry had already begun to call Chief, had a way of endearing himself immediately. The moment they stepped through the door, Chief trotted around, sniffing curiously, his tail wagging despite his obvious exhaustion. Anne noticed Chief the moment she stepped out of the kitchen. She put her hands on her hips, arching an eyebrow as she sized up the scruffy new guest. "Henry Williams," she said, her tone half exasperated and half amused. "What are you doing bringing a stray dog into this house?" Henry scratched his head, giving a small sheepish smile. He was at the train station, all alone. Couldn't just leave him there. Anne gave a small sigh, shaking her head, but as she watched Chief curl up beside the stove, sighing with relief as he warmed his fur, her expression softened. "Well, if he's staying here, he's got to be clean." She grabbed an old towel, filling a basin with warm water, and proceeded to give the little dog a makeshift bath. Chief, though he fidgeted at first, eventually relaxed, his eyes closing as Anne gently scrubbed away the grime and mud. From that moment on, Chief seemed to settle into life on the farm as though he'd been born there. Henry and Chief quickly developed a bond, with Chief following him around the property and observing his every move. They were an inseparable pair, Chief sitting by Henry's feet as he fixed fences, trailing him into the fields, and even curling up by the barn as Henry worked late into the evening. After a few weeks, Henry was convinced that Chief had no owner. No one came forward, no posters were put up, and the train station manager hadn't heard any reports of a lost dog. Anne had also grown attached, though she didn't openly admit it. She simply set an extra plate by the stove, always filled with Chief's favorite scraps, and quietly stitched a small blanket for him to lie on near the fire. Every morning, as Henry left for the small market in town or to work the fields, Chief would walk with him to the edge of the farm, wagging his tail in farewell before watching Henry disappear down the road. At dusk, the dog would wait patiently by the gate, as if he could sense the precise moment Henry would come back. But it wasn't until the first snowfall that winter that Chief's loyalty was fully revealed. One frigid morning, Henry was called to help a neighboring farmer whose tractor had broken down. As he left, he patted Chief's head, promising he'd be back by sundown. Chief stood by the gate as he always did, his eyes never leaving the road, waiting for Henry to return. However, as dusk turned to evening and snow began to fall more heavily, Henry had still not returned. The sky darkened, and the cold bit into the air, turning every breath into puffs of white mist. Chief stayed rooted to his spot by the gate, his eyes fixed on the bend in the road, his breath steaming as he exhaled into the chill. Anne came out to call Chief inside, but he wouldn't budge, his gaze unwavering. She tried coaxing him with warm food, pleading with him to come into the warmth of the house, but Chief only whimpered softly, lowering his head but refusing to leave his post. He seemed to understand that something was wrong, that his friend wasn't coming home on time. Finally, near midnight, Anne sighed, leaving a bowl of food near the gate before retreating inside. Through the window, she watched the Chief, her heart aching as he lay in the snow, nose pointed toward the empty road. The snowfall thickened, blanketing the farm and coating Chief's fur, yet he didn't stir. Then, just as Anne was about to step outside again, she heard the rumble of an engine in the distance. Her heart leapt, and she ran to the door as headlights finally appeared, illuminating the curve in the road. Henry's truck pulled up slowly, and Chief sprang to his feet, his tail wagging furiously, barking with joy. The sight of his friend brought the weary farmer a small, exhausted smile. He opened the door, stepping out as Chief leapt up to greet him, his paws pressing into the snow as he danced around in joy. Henry knelt down, scratching Chief behind the ears, his voice thick with gratitude. "You waited, didn't you, boy?" he murmured. Chief barked, pressing his head into Henry's shoulder, as if reassuring him that he'd always be there, no matter what. That night, Henry brought Chief inside, not to the barn, but to his own bed, letting the dog curl up beside him. He patted Chief's head, and the two drifted off to sleep, warm and safe, a bond of loyalty forged deeper than any words could express. Winter in Maplebrook continued its icy hold, but the bond between Henry and Chief grew stronger with each passing day. Chief became a fixture in the lives of the Williams family, not just as a pet, but as a member of the household. His loyalty to Henry was unwavering, and soon he became known to everyone in town as Henry's faithful companion. As the seasons changed and snow began to melt, bringing signs of spring to Maplebrook, Henry resumed his early morning routine of going into town. Chief would trot alongside him to the end of the property, waiting for Henry's truck to disappear down the road before wandering back to the house. It was as though he knew that Henry had to leave, but felt it his duty to be there to greet him upon his return. Chief's dedication was endearing, and Anne often found herself watching the pair from the kitchen window, a small smile of contentment on her face. One sunny day, after Henry had left for the market, Chief seemed more restless than usual. He lingered by the gate longer, sniffing the air and glancing down the road, his tail low. Anne noticed his behavior and called to him, but Chief didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the direction Henry had gone. She shrugged it off, chalking it up to Chief's usual dedication. But Chief wasn't acting on mere habit. The connection between him and Henry was something beyond instinct, an inexplicable loyalty. When Henry came home that evening, he seemed quieter than usual. He had a slight limp and a bruise on his hand. Anne, ever observant, raised an eyebrow. "Henry Williams, did you get into a tussle with that broken-down tractor again?" Henry chuckled, waving her concern away. "Nothing more than a bump, love. Got a bit tangled up in the engine, that's all. It'll heal right up." Chief, however, seemed unconvinced. He sniffed around Henry's hand, his eyes showing a mix of curiosity and worry. Despite Henry's attempts to brush off the incident, Chief was vigilant, following him around more closely than ever that evening, even as they sat by the fire later. With Henry rubbing Chief's ears, the dog seemed on edge. As the weeks turned into months, Chief's routine at the gate became as much a part of the town's landscape as the rolling hills and dusty road leading into Maplebrook. People passing by in their cars often slowed to wave, recognizing the loyal dog waiting faithfully for his friend. Chief's behavior had become something of a town legend, with neighbors pointing him out to visitors, remarking on his extraordinary patience and loyalty. But things changed one spring afternoon. Henry had left for the local supply store, his usual trip, but Chief noticed a difference in Henry's steps. As he had done many times before, Chief walked with Henry to the gate. But this time, he hesitated as Henry climbed into the truck. Henry noticed Chief's reluctance and chuckled, leaning down to ruffle his fur. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Henry asked softly, his tone gentle but amused. "You've never been one to cling, have you?" But Chief's eyes, dark and steady, remained fixed on Henry, as if he could sense something neither Henry nor anyone else could. Anne, too, noticed Chief's strange behavior that day. The dog sat by the gate long after Henry had left, not budging despite her calls to come inside. When dusk fell, Chief was still there, his gaze never leaving the bend in the road, his tail still as he watched for any sign of Henry's return. Hours passed, and Anne grew more concerned. She prepared supper, glancing occasionally at the clock, and then at the empty chair by the door, where Henry would normally settle with his pipe after a day's work. The silence in the house felt heavy, more so than ever before. It wasn't until late into the night that Anne's worry turned to dread. She wrapped a shawl around herself and stepped outside, her breath visible in the cold night air. She called out to Chief, who hadn't moved from his spot by the gate. When she approached him, Chief turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. She shivered, though not from the cold. "What's wrong, boy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where's Henry?" Chief let out a low whimper, the first sound he'd made all evening. Anne knelt down beside him, her hand stroking his fur as she tried to calm her own growing fears. Early the next morning, a knock on the door startled her awake. A man from town stood on the porch, hat in hand, his face etched with worry. "Anne," he began, his voice hesitant, "we've had some news about Henry." The man explained, in words that seemed to blur together, that Henry had collapsed at the supply store. He had been taken to the hospital, and though they did all they could, he had passed away from a heart condition that no one had known he had. Anne's heart shattered, the weight of the loss settling over her like a dark cloud. She clutched the doorframe for support, feeling the reality of her life tilt and change in an instant. As she absorbed the news, her gaze drifted past the man on her porch and toward the gate, where Chief still waited, his eyes fixed on the road. Anne's throat tightened as she realized that Chief had sensed something wrong long before anyone else had. The faithful dog had known somehow that Henry wouldn't be returning. Despite Anne's grief, Chief's presence became a source of comfort to her. He seemed to understand her sadness, resting his head on her lap in the evenings as she wept quietly. However, his vigil at the gate didn't cease. Every morning, Chief would wait by the gate, his eyes searching for the figure who would never come back. Days turned into weeks, and Anne watched, her heart heavy, as Chief maintained his faithful routine. No amount of coaxing could convince him to abandon his post by the gate. Sometimes, she would sit beside him, stroking his fur, the two of them sharing in a silent sorrow that words couldn't express. One rainy afternoon, Anne approached Chief with an old leather coat Henry had left behind, still carrying faint traces of his scent. She gently placed it on the ground near Chief, hoping it would bring him some comfort. Chief sniffed the coat, his eyes softening as he lay down beside it, curling up as though Henry's presence was still there with him. Anne fought back tears, watching him settle in beside the coat, just as he had so often sat by Henry's side. As the days turned into months, Chief's vigil at the gate became a familiar sight in Maplebrook. People passing by often stopped to offer a word of comfort or a scratch behind the ears. But Chief remained undeterred. His loyalty to Henry was steadfast, a testament to the bond they had shared. Anne, though heartbroken, began to accept Chief's ritual as part of her own healing process. She understood that Chief's love for Henry was as deep as hers, and she respected his need to continue waiting. In some ways, it felt as though they were both holding on to the memory of Henry together, each in their own way. As summer faded and autumn approached, Anne noticed that Chief was growing thinner, his coat dulling with age. Yet his determination didn't waver. Every morning, rain or shine, he would take his place by the gate, his eyes bright with the unspoken hope that Henry might somehow return. It was during these quiet, shared moments by the gate that Anne felt her own sense of purpose slowly returning. She began to take small steps toward moving forward, finding strength in the memory of her husband and the loyal dog who remained as a reminder of the love that had bound them all. Through Chief's unwavering dedication, Anne found herself able to face each day, carrying both the weight of her loss and the warmth of the love they had shared. The seasons changed once more, and the chill of winter returned to Maplebrook. Snow blanketed the town, turning everything into a quiet landscape of white. But one thing remained unchanged: Chief's place by the gate. Though his once vibrant fur had faded, and his steps were slower, his spirit held firm, waiting each day with the loyalty that had made him a town legend. Anne watched from the window every morning as Chief sat by the gate. She knew that he was no longer the spry young dog who had once leapt with joy at the sight of Henry, but rather an aging companion who had committed his life to an enduring promise. She saw his aging figure braving the snow, his nose lifted toward the cold breeze, as though seeking a sign of the friend he had lost. The townspeople had grown used to Chief's daily vigil and often stopped by to bring him treats or offer a warm pat on the head. Children walking to school would wave and call out, "Hi, Chief." Their parents would remind them of Chief's story, of how he waited faithfully for his beloved friend Henry, and many would pause to reflect on the bond between man and dog, a love that seemed timeless. But Chief's body was beginning to show the wear of his years. Anne noticed he struggled to rise some mornings, his joints stiff and his movements slower than they once had been. She brought him blankets and a makeshift bed closer to the house, hoping to ease his old bones. But he continued to sit by the gate, refusing to leave his post. One evening, Anne sat with Chief, the sun setting behind the snow-covered hills, casting a warm pink glow over the quiet neighborhood. She rested her hand on his graying fur, stroking him gently as she whispered, "It's okay, Chief. You've done enough, dear boy. Henry would be so proud of you." Chief looked up at her, his eyes filled with a warmth that spoke of a lifetime of loyalty and love. He leaned his head against her knee, closing his eyes as if he understood every word she had said. A tear slipped down Anne's cheek as she realized that, in his own way, Chief was saying goodbye. In the following days, Chief's energy waned, and he spent more time resting than he did waiting. Anne stayed close by, offering him comfort and companionship as he had once done for her. She knew his time was drawing near, and while the thought of losing him weighed heavily on her heart, she found peace in knowing that he had lived a life filled with purpose, loyalty, and love. Then, one clear winter morning, Chief struggled to his feet and made his way to the gate for the last time. Anne watched from the window, her heart breaking as she saw him settle down, his eyes focused on the road where he had once watched Henry leave each morning. She wrapped herself in a coat and went outside to sit beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. For a moment, as they sat together in the cold silence of the morning, Anne felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She looked up at the clear sky, imagining Henry's warm smile, and feeling somehow his presence there with them. Chief lifted his head one last time, his gaze distant but peaceful, as if he too sensed the presence of his old friend. A gentle breath escaped him, and his body stilled, his spirit finally at rest. Anne sat there for a long time, her heart both broken and full. As the sun began to rise over Maplebrook, she knew that Chief's love for Henry had carried him through all these years, that his devotion had been as constant as the turning of the seasons, and she felt a profound gratitude for the time they had shared. In the days that followed, the people of Maplebrook paid tribute to Chief, sharing stories of his unwavering loyalty and the love he had inspired in everyone who knew him. Children drew pictures of Chief by the gate, and the neighbors placed flowers and small mementos at his resting place. It was clear to all that Chief had been more than just a dog. He had been a symbol of love, loyalty, and the bonds that outlast even the greatest distances. Anne found solace in knowing that Chief had remained true to his friend until the very end. Though her home was quieter without his familiar presence, she felt a deep peace in her heart, as if Henry and Chief were together again, their spirits bound by a love that transcended time and space. Years later, Maplebrook honored Chief's memory by placing a small statue of him near the gate, where he had kept his vigil. It served as a reminder of the loyalty and love he had shown, a legacy that would live on in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed his story. And on quiet mornings, Anne would sit by the gate, her hand resting on the statue, remembering the love that had bound them all. For Anne, Henry, and Chief, their story was one of love, loyalty, and the belief that true friendship never truly dies. It lives on, carried by memories, by the warmth of shared moments, and by the unbreakable bond that even time itself could not sever.